Prologue. The word landed on the breakfast table like a blade. Broodmare. Said casually, between a sip of tea and a reach for the marmalade, by Princess Seraphine Blackbourne, the king's elder sister, the most powerful woman in the Blackbourne court, and the person who had spent 11 months making my life a masterwork of quiet misery. She did not whisper it. She did not sneer it. She said it the way you say a fact so obvious it requires no emphasis. She turned to Lady Cordelia Strand, her closest friend and permanent audience, and said, "The broodmare still has not conceived. One wonders whether the king should explore more productive options." She said it in front of 12 people at the royal family breakfast. She said it 3 seats away from me. She said it while I was holding a cup of tea that my hands were shaking too hard to lift. This was not the first time. That is the part the court would later pretend not to know. That the breakfast comment was not an isolated cruelty, but the capstone of 11 months of systematic degradation that Seraphine had conducted with the precision of a woman who understood power architecture and had decided to use hers to destroy someone who could not fight back. The first insult had been small, a comment about my accent at my second state dinner. The second had been larger, a public correction of my table manners that had drawn laughter from the court. The third, fourth, fifth, 100th, they accumulated like snowfall, each one barely visible, the total weight crushing. I had not told my husband. That requires explanation, because the obvious question is why? Why endure 11 months of abuse from his sister without telling the man who could stop it? The answer is the specific trap that royal and law dynamics create. Seraphine was Edric's only surviving family. Their parents were dead. Their brother had died in the border wars. Seraphine was the last of the Blackbourne bloodline besides Edric himself, and their bond was the foundational relationship of his emotional life. Telling him meant forcing a choice between his wife and his sister. And I knew, because Seraphine had told me, explicitly, in a private conversation during my first month at the palace, that I would lose that contest. "He will always choose me," she had said with the serene confidence of a woman stating the weather. "I have been his family for 37 years. You have been his wife for 3 weeks. Do not test the math, dear." The math had kept me silent for 11 months. But today, at this breakfast, with 12 people present and the word broodmare sitting on the table like a stain no one was cleaning, something changed. Not inside me. I had been broken in this specific way for months. Something changed in the room. Something shifted in the quality of the silence that followed Seraphine's comment. Because this time, the king was at the table. For 11 months, Seraphine had conducted her campaign when Edric was absent, at functions he did not attend, in rooms he had left, during the specific windows of his schedule that she had memorized precisely to ensure her cruelty never had to compete with his presence. But this morning, a cancelled meeting had returned him to the breakfast table unexpectedly, and he heard it. Every syllable. Every inflection, the casual, practiced ease of a woman who had said things like this so many times that the words no longer required effort. Edric Blackbourne set down his knife. Not dropped, set down, with a deliberation that made the small sound of metal on porcelain the loudest thing in the room. And everything that happened next became the most talked about breakfast in the history of the Blackbourne court. His sister called her a broodmare at breakfast, in front of 12 people. After 11 months of abuse timed precisely to avoid the king's presence. But today, the king was there. He set down his knife, and the woman who had spent 11 months believing she was untouchable was about to learn the difference between being the king's sister and being right. Chapter 1. My name is Thessaly Navarro. I was 29 when I married Alpha King Edric Blackbourne, and I arrived at the Blackbourne Palace with the cautious optimism of a woman who had been told her marriage was arranged for political reasons, but who had met her husband twice before the wedding and found him, against her own skeptical expectations, kind, not charming, not romantic, not the dramatic alpha that novels promised. Kind. Quiet kind, in the way of a man who had lost most of his family and had learned to express care through attention rather than performance. He remembered things. Small things, my preference for chamomile over black tea, my discomfort with crowded rooms, the fact that I hummed when I was concentrating. He noticed the way observant people notice, without announcing it, without expecting credit. just filing information about the people he cared about and adjusting his behavior accordingly. I loved him within 3 months. Not with the instant, dramatic recognition of a fated bond. Our marriage was arranged, our connection built rather than bestowed. I loved him because he was the first alpha I had met who treated my opinions as data rather than inconvenience, who asked what I thought about the trade negotiations and actually incorporated my analysis, who sat with me in the evenings reading in companionable silence, because he had learned that I processed the day through quiet rather than conversation. He was not perfect. He worked too much, delegated too little, and had the emotional communication skills of a man who had been raised in a family that expressed love through obligation rather than words. But he was good, and good, I had learned by 29, was rarer and more valuable than exciting. Seraphine began testing me during the first week. Not overtly, she was too intelligent for overt. The first tests were subtle enough to be coincidental, a seating arrangement at dinner that placed me at the far end, separated from Edric. A scheduling conflict that ensured my introduction to the Ladies' Council was postponed 3 times. A wardrobe recommendation that resulted in me wearing a color that washed out my complexion at my first public appearance. Each incident was small enough to be accidental. The pattern was unmistakable. Seraphine Blackbourne was not welcoming her brother's wife into the family. She was establishing the hierarchy. The hierarchy said, I am first. You are an addition, and additions can be removed. The escalation was gradual and masterful. By month 3, the subtle tests had become direct comments, observations about my accent, my background, my family's status relative to the Blackbourne name. By month 6, the comments had become public. Corrections delivered at court functions, opinions shared with ladies in waiting who repeated them with the enthusiastic cruelty of people who had been given permission to punch down. By month 9, Seraphine had established a narrative so pervasive that the entire court operated within it. The Navarro bride was not good enough. Not bred well enough, not polished enough, not Blackbourne enough. And most devastatingly, not fertile enough. The heir obsession had started in month 4, when Seraphine began tracking my cycle through observations she shared with her circle with clinical detachment. The Broodmare language appeared in month 7, initially in private, escalating to semi-public, and finally, this morning, arriving at the breakfast table fully formed, in front of the king. Like a weapon that had been sharpened in private and was ready for public deployment. 11 months of escalation. From subtle to savage. From seating arrangements to Broodmare. The king's sister had spent nearly a year building a campaign of destruction so precisely timed that the one person who could stop it never witnessed it. Until a cancelled meeting returned him to breakfast, and the weapon she had been sharpening in private was deployed in front of the one audience she had spent 11 months avoiding. Chapter 2. Edric set down his knife at 8:47 a.m. The gesture was small, a utensil placed on porcelain, but the silence it created was architectural. 12 people stopped eating, stopped breathing, stopped existing as individual humans, and became a single, collective held breath, because the Alpha King had set down his knife with the specific, controlled deliberation of a man who was choosing his next action with extreme care, and whose choices, at this level of power, reshaped worlds. He did not look at me. That was the first thing I noticed. He did not check on his wife, did not assess my reaction, did not offer the comforting glance that a lesser response would have begun with. He looked at his sister, and the expression on his face was something I had never seen in 11 months of marriage, not anger, which is hot and reactive and burns itself out. Something colder, the expression of a man who was rapidly, efficiently processing a large amount of new information and reorganizing his entire understanding of a situation based on what he had just heard. Seraphine, he said. His voice was conversational. Calm. The particular calm that people who knew Edric well, Commander Inez Valdez, his head of security, and Lord Oscar Lindgren, his chief advisor, both present at the table, recognized as the most dangerous register he possessed. Not shouting, not threatening. Just level, measured, and utterly devoid of the familial warmth that had characterized every interaction between the siblings for 37 years. Did you just refer to my wife as a broodmare? Seraphine's composure flickered. Barely, she was too practiced for a full crack, but enough that the 12 witnesses saw it. I was making an observation about the succession, she said smoothly. The court is concerned. I did not ask about the court, Edric interrupted. I asked whether you called my wife a broodmare. The word. At this table, in front of these people, did you say it? The pause lasted 3 seconds. Yes, Seraphine said. But, he held up one hand. The gesture stopped her mid-sentence with the efficiency of a door closing. How long? He asked. The question confused everyone at the table except me. I understood immediately what he was asking, because I had spent 11 months inside the answer. How long have you been speaking to her like this? Seraphine's composure cracked further. I do not. How long, Seraphine? Because the ease with which you said that word tells me it is not the first time. It tells me you have been practicing. The casualness was rehearsed. You have said it before, in other rooms, to other audiences, enough times that it no longer requires effort. So I am asking, how long have you been treating my wife this way? And I am asking in front of these people, because these people are clearly accustomed to hearing it, which means they have been your audience before. Their silence is not shock. It is habit. The room became a crime scene under examination. 12 people with varying degrees of guilt, Lady Cordelia, who had laughed at every comment and amplified every cruelty, Lord Beaumont, who had repeated Seraphine's observations to his own circle, the 3 ladies-in-waiting who had been Seraphine's most reliable instruments of gossip, and the others who had not participated actively but had not intervened either, the silent majority whose silence had functioned as permission. Edric read the room the way a commander reads a battlefield, and what he saw confirmed what the word broodmare had told him. This was not an incident. It was a system. And the system had been operating inside his palace, against his wife, for 11 months, hidden from him through deliberate scheduling and the particular architecture of a bully who knew her target's protector well enough to avoid his gaze. He set down the knife and asked, How long? Not how dare you. How long? Because the casualness of the cruelty told him it was practiced. The silence of the room told him it was witnessed, and the fact that he had never seen it told him it was hidden. Deliberately, by the one person who knew his schedule well enough to time her cruelty around his absence. Chapter 3. What happened next became legend. Not because it was violent or dramatic. Edric Blackbourne was not a dramatic man. Because it was precise. Surgical. The response of a king who understood that the most effective use of power was not spectacle but consequence. Seraphine, he said, you are dismissed from this table, from this breakfast, from this palace. Effective immediately. The room stopped. Seraphine's face went white. Dismissed? I am your sister. You are my sister, Edric agreed. And you used that position, the one relationship I cannot replace, as a weapon against the woman I chose to share my life with. You calculated that I would not choose her over you. You told her that, did you not? That I would always choose you. He did not look at me for confirmation. He did not need to. He had read the architecture of the situation in 30 seconds and understood the load-bearing wall. You weaponized my love for you, he continued. You used it as a shield while you systematically degraded my wife. You timed your cruelty to avoid my presence because you knew, Seraphine, that if I heard what you were saying, I would do exactly what I am doing now. You hid it. Which means you knew it was wrong. And you did it anyway. Seraphine stood. Her composure, which had been cracking, reassembled itself into the particular dignity of a woman who had been powerful long enough to perform grace under fire. Edric, you are being emotional. This is a family matter. It is not a family matter, Edric said. It is a governance matter. You have been conducting a campaign of harassment against the Queen inside my palace, using my court as your instrument, and hiding it from me through strategic scheduling. That is not sibling disagreement. That is abuse of position. And the consequence of abusing a position in this palace is losing it. She stared at him. He held her gaze with the absolute, unblinking steadiness of a man who had made his decision and was not available for negotiation. Then she turned to me, and the look she gave me was so full of concentrated hatred that my chest physically tightened, and she left the breakfast room, with the rigid posture of a woman who had walked into this morning as the most powerful person in the palace besides the king and was walking out as someone whose power had been revoked in 5 minutes over. scrambled eggs and the word broodmare. After the door closed, Edric addressed the table. Every person in this room heard what was said this morning. Some of you have heard similar things before. Some of you participated, repeated comments, amplified cruelty, made my wife's life smaller through the specific mechanics of gossip and exclusion. He looked at Lady Cordelia, whose face was the color of the tablecloth. I will not name individuals today, but I want every person at this table to understand something. What happened to my wife was not palace gossip. It was coordinated cruelty, enabled by silence. If you participated, you have 1 week to come forward and acknowledge it. If you were silent, you have 1 week to consider why your silence was easier than intervention. After 1 week, Commander Valdez will begin a formal review of the court's social conduct over the past 11 months, and those who are found to have participated will face consequences proportional to their involvement. He picked up his knife, resumed eating. My wife makes excellent eggs, he said to Lord Lindgren, who was staring at his plate with the particular focus of a man who wanted to be anywhere else. She learned from her grandmother. She has been cooking breakfast for the household since month 2 because the kitchen staff underseasons everything and she was too polite to complain. Did you know that? Lord Lindgren swallowed. No, Your Majesty, no, Edric agreed. No one knew. Because no one asked. That is the second thing that changes today. He dismissed his own sister, his only surviving family. In front of 12 witnesses over scrambled eggs with the controlled precision of a man who understood that love without accountability is just another form of power abuse. Then he picked up his knife and told the table his wife made excellent eggs, because noticing was the first step. And the king had just started paying attention. Chapter 4. After breakfast, Edric came to my chambers. He did not knock in the perfunctory way of someone entering their own space. He knocked and waited, giving me the choice to open or not. I opened. He stood in the doorway with an expression I had never seen, grief and fury braided together so tightly they were indistinguishable. How long? He asked again, this time asking me. Since the first week, I said. He closed his eyes. 11 months. I nodded. And you did not tell me, because she told me you would choose her. And I believed her. Because she was your family, and I was an arrangement. And because telling you meant making you choose. And I could not bear being the reason you lost your last family member. So, I absorbed it, every comment, every correction, every public humiliation. I absorbed it, and smiled, and went to our rooms at night and lay beside you, and said nothing, because nothing felt safer than the alternative. He crossed the room, sat beside me, and took my hands. His were shaking. The Alpha King, whose hands were steady through crises that threatened his territory, was shaking holding his wife's fingers. You should never have had to make that calculation, he said. The fact that you believed I would choose her, that tells me I failed to show you where you stand. Not above Seraphine. Not below her. You stand beside me, Thessaly. Equal. First. The person I chose. And no amount of blood relation overrides that, because family is not an entitlement. It is a responsibility. And Seraphine abandoned that responsibility the moment she used it as a weapon against you. I cried. Not the controlled tears of a woman who had been managing her pain for 11 months, the structural release of a person who had been holding a building upright through sheer will and had finally been told she could let go. He held me. Not with the careful political comfort of a king managing a situation, with the desperate, shaking grip of a man who had just discovered that someone he loved had been suffering inside his own home, under his own roof, hidden by the one person he trusted most. And he had not seen it. The court review was comprehensive. Commander Valdez, who had the particular temperament of a woman who took institutional abuse personally, conducted interviews with every member of the household. The findings confirmed what I had experienced. Seraphine's campaign had been systematic, strategic, and supported by a network of enablers who participated because aligning with the king's sister was politically advantageous and opposing her was professionally dangerous. Lady Cordelia Strand was removed from court. 3 ladies in waiting were reassigned, and a formal protocol was established, the first of its kind in the Blackbourne territories, that defined acceptable conduct toward the Queen and provided a reporting mechanism for abuse that did not require the victim to confront the perpetrator directly. I had been too afraid to tell Edric. The protocol ensured that the next person in my position would not have to be. She told him, 11 months. His hands shook. He held her while the building she had been holding up alone finally collapsed. Then he built systems to ensure no one would have to hold that building alone again. Because the right response to discovering abuse is not just stopping it, it is making it structurally impossible. Chapter 5. Seraphine wrote to Edric 3 months after her dismissal. The letter was long, articulate, and carefully constructed to frame her behavior as protective rather than destructive. I was worried about the bloodline, she wrote. The succession requires an heir, and the Navarro woman was not. Edric stopped reading at the Navarro woman. He brought the letter to me because, he said, transparency was the minimum requirement for trust after 11 months of secrets. Then he wrote his response, Seraphine. Her name is Thessaly. When you can write it, her name, not her family, not a function, not a livestock term, you may write to me again. Until then, there is nothing to discuss. He sent it. She did not write again for 6 months. When she did, the letter began, Dear Thessaly and Edric. It was a start. The reconciliation, if it could be called that, took 2 years. Not forgiveness. I was not certain I would ever fully forgive Seraphine. And I did not believe forgiveness was required for a functional relationship. What we built instead was accountability. Seraphine attended formal counseling as a condition of gradual reintroduction to court. She met with me privately, accompanied by a mediator, and heard, for the first time without deflection, the specific impact of 11 months of her behavior. She listened. Not comfortably, not graciously, but she listened. And she said, after 3 sessions, I was afraid. The confession surprised me. Of what? Of losing him, she said. He was all I had left. Our parents, our brother, gone. Edric was the last, and when you arrived, I felt the balance shift. He oriented toward you, not away from me, toward you. And I could not distinguish between him gaining a wife and me losing a brother. So I made you the enemy. Because enemies are simpler than change. It was not an excuse. She did not offer it as one. But it was an explanation that I recognized, the fear of loss expressed as cruelty toward the perceived threat. It did not erase 11 months. Nothing erases 11 months. But it reframed the architecture from malice to grief. And grief, however poorly expressed, was something I could build a bridge across. Edric and Seraphine rebuilt their relationship slowly, with me as a visible, valued, non-negotiable part of the equation. Family dinners where Seraphine used my name. Court functions where she stood beside me instead of above me. Small gestures that accumulated into a new pattern, replacing the old one brick by brick. Our son was born 14 months after the breakfast, not because Seraphine's timeline demanded it, because we were ready, on our terms, in our time. We named him Mateo, after my grandfather, because Edric said the Navarro name deserved to be carried forward inside the Blackborn line. Seraphine held him for the first time with an expression that combined tenderness and the particular shame of a woman remembering that she had called the baby's mother a broodmare, and knowing that the child in her arms existed despite her cruelty, not because of it. She whispered something to the baby that I almost did not hear. I am sorry I tried to reduce your mother to what she could produce. She produced you, and you are magnificent. And so is she. It was the first time she had called me magnificent. I did not fully believe it. But I noted it, and I added it to the new architecture, brick by brick, alongside the eggs and the name and the knife set down on porcelain at 8:47 on a morning that changed everything. Epilogue. 3 years later, Mateo was 2, and had Edric's intensity and my stubbornness, and a voice that carried from the nursery to the council chamber in a way that both delighted and alarmed the staff. Seraphine visited monthly. The visits were structured, boundaried, and nothing like the unchecked power she had wielded before the breakfast. She brought Mateo elaborate gifts that he ignored in favor of the wrapping paper, which he found more interesting. She sat through family meals where I cooked. The eggs Edric had praised at the infamous breakfast had become our tradition. My grandmother's recipe, seasoned properly because the kitchen staff had finally learned, and she participated in conversations where my opinions were treated as contributions rather than intrusions. One morning, Seraphine arrived for a visit and found me in the kitchen making breakfast. She stood in the doorway the way Edric had stood after the confrontation, waiting to be invited in rather than assuming access. I poured her tea without being asked. She sat at the kitchen table, not the formal breakfast room where the word had been spoken, but the private kitchen where the family actually lived. "Thank you," she said. "For the tea? For letting me back in." She paused. "I spent 11 months trying to push you out. And you survived it. Not because you are strong, though you are. Because you loved my brother enough to absorb cruelty rather than force him to choose. That was not weakness, Thessaly. That was a sacrifice I did not deserve and he did not know about, and I am ashamed that my behavior required it." I set down the teapot. "You are right," I said. "It was a sacrifice you did not deserve, and it is one I should not have had to make. The protocols exist now so that no one after me has to." She nodded. "Because of you. Because your brother set down a knife and made a choice," I said. "I gave him the information. He made the choice." "Give yourself credit for surviving long enough to be heard," she said quietly. "That is the part most people do not understand. The cruelty is visible. The surviving is not." I looked at my sister-in-law across a kitchen table, over tea and eggs, 3 years removed from the worst word anyone had ever called me. And I saw something I had not seen in 11 months of her cruelty or 2 years of her rehabilitation, genuine understanding. Not performed. Felt, the kind that only comes from a person who has looked at their own behavior and found it monstrous, and has chosen, daily, to be something better. It was not forgiveness. It was architecture. New walls, new rooms, new foundations built on the rubble of what she had destroyed. Not the same house. A different one, stronger, because it had been built by people who knew exactly what collapse looked like and had decided, together, never to let it happen again. His sister called her a broodmare at breakfast. The Alpha King set down his knife and dismissed her. Everyone was shocked. But the real story was not the dismissal. It was the 11 months before it. The quiet survival, the absorbed cruelty, the sacrifice of silence. And the breakfast that changed everything was not the one where the word was spoken. It was the one 3 years later in a kitchen, over eggs, where 2 women who had been enemies sat across from each other and chose to build something new from the wreckage of what had been destroyed.